Uh, Welcome to Manifested Publishers. We are handling economics, that is April 2024 paper, question 5. The first question on 5, that is A, explain 5 disadvantages of managed floating exchange rate. Explain 5 disadvantages. Explain, that is 5A, explain 5 disadvantages of managed floating exchange rate. Explain 5 disadvantages of managed floating exchange rate. So the first thing is to understand what we mean by managed floating exchange rate. The first meaning of a managed floating exchange rate, this is where government intervene to manage the difference in exchange rate, and this management of floating or varying exchange rate is basically done by the government through the central bank. Is basically managed by the government through the central bank. And we know that how is it being managed? The government intervened by selling and buying of currency in order to maintain that stability. The government intervened by coming in to buy and selling of currencies to maintain a certain exchange rate, to basically manage a certain is sure exchange rate. So that is what we mean by managed floating exchange rate. So the first disadvantage, you say different government. One you say different government set different exchange rates. So the different government we know basically set different exchange rate. That different government would basically have a different exchange rate, which is inconsistent, with others. So that is the first disadvantage of managed floating exchange rate. That different government will basically set different exchange rate, which is inconsistent with the other. We can talk about the fiscal policy tend to be weaker. Number 2, the fiscal policy. We call it the fiscal policy. The fiscal policy tend to be weaker. And we say that when you talk about fiscal policy, we're basically talking about how the government basically uses taxes and expenditure to manage the economy. So the next reason why, disadvantages of managed floating exchange rate is that the fiscal policy tend to be weaker. Then we can have managed exchange rate can be manipulated. Managed floating exchange rate can be manipulated. We say can be manipulated by the government. They can easily be manipulated by the government. The managed floating exchange rate can easily be manipulated by the government because the government is the one that is basically involved in managing that variation through the central bank, that is by buying and selling currency to basically have what we call a certain range. So lastly, we can talk about countries become involved. We have number 4, or not lastly, countries become involved because it varies for countries. We say that basically countries becomes involved. We basically say that the countries become involved. The countries become involved in rounds of competitive, because each country is trying to bring certainty in the exchange rate, round of competitive devaluation, we say in order to, round of devaluation in order to capture what we call competitive advantage. In order to capture competitive advantage. Devaluation, we know that the value of the currency being lower as compared to other currency in order to capture what we call competitive advantage. But lastly, we can talk about the last five. We can say that whenever we talked about managed floating exchange rate, we know that there is variety. Different countries, that is say different countries set different exchange rate, and this leads to variation in the exchange rate. We can see when they set for their competitiveness, it leads to variation in the exchange rate. This would basically lead, because different countries set different exchange rate depending on what they want to come up with, and this leads to the variation in the exchange rate. Those are basically how we manage that particular question. But again, the examiner can be very clear and ask the learners or those that are tested, to talk about now what are the advantages of managed floating. The word is managed floating exchange rate, which is also different from floating exchange rate and the fixed exchange rate. So learners can move ahead and look at the fixed exchange rate. Learners can also look at the floating exchange rate. Remember, this particular question was on the managed floating, not floating exchange rate, but managed floating exchange rate, where we say that the government is basically involved in managing the exchange rate by buying and selling currency to bring the rate of to maintain certain rates in the economy. That is how we particularly handle that question 5, Roman 1.